In 1860, a full block of Chicago storefronts, brick and stone, 4 and 5 stories, 35,000 tons in all, rose nearly 5 feet into the air while shoppers still walked in and out of the doors. Nothing was demolished. Nothing was rebuilt from scratch. 6,000 screw jacks, turned by hand, lifted the entire block onto a new foundation, 1 fraction of an inch at a time. This is how they moved entire city blocks without engines. Chicago's problem was elevation. The city sat only a few feet above Lake Michigan on marshy ground, with nowhere for wastewater to drain. Standing water bred disease for 2 decades, and in 1854 a cholera outbreak killed 6% of the city's population. In 1856, engineer Ellis S. Chesbrough proposed a citywide sewer system, but the pipes could only drain if the street sat higher than the water table. Rather than tear down what already stood, the city chose to lift it, buildings, sidewalks and all, onto the new grade. Owners who declined were left with storefronts sitting below street level, cut off from their own front doors. George Pullman arrived in Chicago in 1857, in his mid-20s, already trained in the trade. His father had moved buildings along the route of the Erie Canal in New York, using a wheeled device of his own design. Pullman replaced the wheels with greased wooden skids, which let him slide a building across the ground with less risk of damage. He took contracts to raise brick buildings onto new foundations, promising clients he would not disturb a guest or break a single pane of glass. He later used the profits from these contracts to found the Pullman Palace Car Company. The first masonry building raised to Chicago's new grade went up in January 1858. A 4-story brick structure at Randolph and Dearborn lifted 6 feet 2 inches on 200 jack screws. Crews tunneled under the foundation and positioned a jack every few feet along each wall. Each jack had its own operator. On a called signal, every man turned his jack the same fraction of a rotation, so the whole structure rose together, evenly, an inch or less at a time. By the end of that year, more than 50 comparably large buildings had been raised the same way. Uneven force was the real danger. If one section of a building rose faster than another, walls could crack or floors could buckle out of level. In November 1865, contractors Hollingsworth and Coughlin raised the 5-story Robbins Building, an iron-fronted structure weighing an estimated 27,000 tons, using 1,584 jack screws turned in careful sequence over 3 days. The entire mass came up 27.5 inches without significant damage reported. In 1861, engineers raised the Tremont House, a 6-story luxury hotel occupying more than an acre of downtown Chicago. 500 men worked beneath it in covered trenches, turning 1,000 jack screws in unison. Business continued upstairs the entire time. Guests came and went, some never noticed. One later complained that the hotel's front steps seemed to grow steeper by the day, and that by the time he checked out, windows once at eye level stood several feet above his head. The hotel rose 6 feet without incident. Not every building needed lifting. Chicago's older wooden buildings were often judged not worth raising, so owners set them on rollers instead and hauled them to the outskirts by horse team, sometimes with residents still living inside. Visitor David McCrae wrote that he never spent a day in the city without meeting a house shifting its quarters. Once he counted 9 in a single afternoon, and streetcars routinely stopped to let buildings cross the road. Raising an entire block at once demanded a different kind of coordination. In 1860, 6 engineering firms combined forces to lift a full acre of Lake Street shops and offices, 320 feet of storefronts, using 600 men and 6,000 jack screws, elevating the whole assembly 4 feet 8 inches in 5 days. The same logic reached New York 3 decades later, applied to a different problem. By 1888, beach erosion had brought the Atlantic Ocean to the foundation of Brooklyn's Brighton Beach Hotel, a 5,000-ton structure 460 feet long. Rather than lose the hotel to the tide, engineer B.C. Miller's crew raised the entire building on 13 hydraulic jacks, then jacked it onto 24 lines of railroad track, loaded it onto more than 100 flat cars, and had 6 steam locomotives haul it roughly 600 feet inland. The move took 9 days. When it was done, not one window pane had broken. It is generally regarded as the largest building relocation of the 19th century. The difference between a competent lift and a dangerous one showed up only under load. A building raised or rolled unevenly might stand for years before a crack finally reached the surface, long after the crew responsible had moved to the next contract. The buildings raised in Chicago in the 1860s were engineered to standards that held. Many of the structures lifted onto new foundations that decade were still standing, unaltered by the move when the Great Chicago Fire reached them in 1871. And it was the fire, not the earlier engineering, that finally brought most of them down. Watching a building move became, for a time, ordinary entertainment. Crowds gathered by the thousands to see the Lake Street block go up, and were allowed to walk at the old street level among the jacks on the final day. For a young city short on monuments and long on ambition, a 5-story block of shops rising into the air on command was its own kind of spectacle, proof that engineering, not just capital, could bend an entire city to a new elevation without asking anyone to leave. The technique did not disappear so much as it ran out of use. By the 1870s, Chicago's grade raising was largely complete, and the wave of new construction that followed the 1871 fire went up increasingly fireproof, and within a generation, steel-framed, anchored deep enough that raising or rolling them whole was no longer practical. House moving on rollers persisted into the 20th century for smaller wood frame buildings, but for masonry blocks and hotels, the era of lifting an entire structure by hand, jack by jack, effectively ended with the century that invented it. Long before modern hydraulic transport systems and remote-controlled lifts, moving a building depended on the same principle it does today. Spread the load evenly, move it slowly, and trust the patience of the crew turning each jack in sequence. The tools have changed. Screw jacks became hydraulics, wooden skids became steel rollers, but a 1,000-ton house moved through Chicago in the 21st century rests on the same logic that lifted the Tremont House in 1861. What survives from that earlier era is mostly photographs, and a handful of relocated buildings still standing on foundations they were never originally built for. These techniques shaped American cities quietly. If you'd like to see more of them preserved, consider subscribing, and tell us which forgotten technique we should uncover next.